Senator Joseph Raymond McCarthy of Wisconsin remains one of our most maligned figures in American politics. Carrying the banner of anti-communism, Senator McCarthy has repeatedly been proven right about a communistic takeover in the highest echelons of the American government. But the extent of his righteousness remains difficult to prove, since his papers and the unpublished biography by his wife, Jean McCarthy, remained sealed by the American government until 2003. Even today, footage of McCarthy is almost impossible to find, with no film publicly available at the National Archives or the Library of Congress. Senator McCarthy's personal and professional papers were made available exclusively to author Larry Tye in 2020. Tye used them in his book, Demagogue: The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. This video relies on Tye's research. McCarthy's grandfather, Stephen Patrick McCarthy, established the family's foothold in the United States in the mid-1800s. A native of Ireland, Stephen traveled to Wisconsin's Fox River Valley, where he bought 160 acres for $600, as migrants at the time were expected to come into the United States with cash. The pioneer in Stephen would have found this untamed hinterland of waterfowl and white bass more appealing than his first and more subdued landing spot in rural New York State. Irish Catholics were welcome enough in the Appleton area of Wisconsin and had already carved out a colony for themselves amid settlements of transplanted Germans, Dutch, Scots, and New Englanders. The timing of Stephen's journey to the United States, like so many migrants of that time, was dictated by international events. In Stephen McCarthy's case, it was the Irish potato famine that drew him from Ireland's shores. Of course, at this time, the United States has accepted more illegals than it ever did Irish or Italians in the 1800s. You can learn more about the struggle of the Irish in America in its video on this channel. Even though the Wisconsin acreage McCarthy had bought sight unseen included a large swath of swampland, the hard-working farmer coaxed enough from the loam to be able to bring over his mother and to marry Margaret Stoffel, a Bavarian immigrant whose parents farmed the land across the road. Together they raised 6 boys and 4 girls. Timothy, the third of Margaret and Stephen's children, spoke with his father's Irish brogue and stayed on his parents' farm, inheriting 143 acres in the rustic township of Grand Chute, Wisconsin. In 1901, he followed his father's example by marrying a neighbor, Bridget Tierney. Her father and mother were both Irish immigrants, although her family was a bit more prosperous than the McCarthys. The couple shared child-rearing duties, which was almost as unusual for Irish Americans as was Tim's teetotaling. The old man, as his kids called him, carved out farm operations, and he persuaded his children, never spanked them for discipline. Bridget, or Bid, was the family balance wheel, dispensing practical advice about home baking and homemaking. Dog bite Indian once, dog's fault, she said. Dog bite Indian twice, Indian's fault. Tim's advice was more straightforward. Don't forget to say your prayers. If some dismissed Joseph McCarthy and the rest of his family as shanty Irish, he had heard it before. It was one more chip on his shoulder he carried proudly his entire life. The devotion to Roman Catholicism was also very present. Every Sunday they rode their buckboard and later their Dodge truck 7 miles to St. Mary's Church in Appleton, just as their parents and other Irish neighbors did. Wisconsin farm families ran big, and the McCarthys already had 4 children at home by the fall of 1908. Unfortunately, the Trump administration did not appreciate this in 2020 when it let the largest number of Wisconsin farm bankruptcies occur in American history. Instead of funding bailouts via the USDA, money went to occupied Palestine or Israel. In November 1908, with help from a midwife, Bid McCarthy delivered the largest of her babies, Joseph Raymond. He came at an opportune moment, soon after the family had moved from a cramped log cabin to their white clapboard house with 8 rooms and 2 porches. Electricity and indoor plumbing would come later. If his earliest years planted the seeds of his religious identity, his years at Marquette University also left a mark. Joseph McCarthy took 4 semesters of theology courses as required for Catholic engineering students. He earned A's in the first 2 on natural religion, which focused more on philosophy than on doctrine. He did less well in social justice sacraments, getting a B the first semester and a C the second. What stuck with him was his church's opposition to communism and its index of forbidden texts. Books were banned if they contained material deemed to be heretical, and a list of Marquette students who did read them for a class was forwarded to the Archbishop every semester. Such tabulations, which had been around since the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, were discontinued by Pope Paul VI in 1966. But the forbidden history of communism attracted McCarthy, who learned about it throughout his teens. Another step on McCarthy's political and spiritual ladders came when, as the junior senator from Wisconsin, he fell in love with his aide, Jean Kerr. Religion kept the pair apart early on because Jean was raised Presbyterian, but she finally embraced his Catholicism and converted. Gradually, as I came to understand the Catholic faith and I began to see how much his faith meant to him in a quiet, basic way, like breathing or eating, I saw a new side to Jo. Jean explained in the Jo McCarthy I Knew, her unpublished memoir that was part of the aforementioned stash of records kept under lock and key by the American federal government for 60 years. Behind the warm, happy, bubbling personality, behind the kidding and the humor, was a serious man, a purposeful man, whom God had endowed with an extremely keen, absorbent, and discriminating mind, and the drive to make right what was wrong. Jean had it right about McCarthy's faith. It was heartfelt. For years he quietly mailed $50 a month to Catholic missionaries he met in the South Pacific during his service in World War II. In 1942, McCarthy joined the United States Marine Corps, despite the fact that his judicial office exempted him from military service. He entered the Marines as a first lieutenant. He served as an intelligence briefing officer for a dive bomber squadron in the Solomon Islands for 30 months, and held the rank of captain at the time he resigned his commission in April 1945. He volunteered to fly 12 combat missions as a gunner observer, and he became acquainted with the ins and outs of the State Department as well as the United States military. He campaigned for the Republican Senate nomination in Wisconsin while still on active duty in 1944, but was defeated by incumbent Alexander Wiley. After he left the Marines in April 1945, he was re-elected unopposed to his circuit court position in Wisconsin. He then began a much more systematic campaign for the 1946 Republican Senate primary nomination. In this race, he challenged 3-term Senator Robert M. La Follette, Jr., founder of the Wisconsin Progressive Party, who had not enlisted to fight in World War II, and was the son and nepo baby of the celebrated Wisconsin Governor Robert M. La Follette, Sr. While McCarthy managed his investments himself, netting him $500,000 by 1945, Follette relied on firms and other investment structures, which hurt him when McCarthy called him out on the campaign trail. McCarthy seldom missed a Sunday Mass or a chance to confess. Friends describe tripping over him in the dark as he knelt to pray. Others recall taking him from Sunday Mass to a craps game at Milwaukee's Hotel Schroeder, which lasted until Monday afternoon, and he refused to travel, even in an elevator, without his money clip bearing the image of St. Teresa of Lisieux, the patron of missions. The Wisconsin Catholics are generally different from other Catholics in different areas of the United States because they are more consistently blue-collar. Urban legend has it Milwaukee smells of beer every Sunday morning, as the bar doors have opened for decades to let churchgoers out on their way to Mass. Father Crosby once said few Catholic politicians ever made less public display of their religion than did Joe McCarthy. And while Father Crosby worried, McCarthy thought that going to Sunday Mass, as well as getting baptized, married, and buried in the church, was all that Catholicism stood for, he conceded that he observed these functions with a fidelity that would have brought joy to the heart of many a Catholic pastor. In 1950, McCarthy hit journalist Drew Pearson in the cloakroom at the Soulgrave Club, repeatedly kneeing him in the groin. McCarthy, who admitted to the assault, claimed he merely slapped Pearson. Pearson, ever the journalist, retaliated by publishing a narrative via the Nevada journalist Hank Greenspun that McCarthy was gay in 1952. This narrative reached such a height that J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI investigated it and found, quote, homosexuals are very bitter against Senator McCarthy for his attack upon those who are supposed to be in the government. So we see this common tactic of accusing straight white men as gay when they're not. Pearson was probably coming on to McCarthy in the cloakroom for blackmail or other purposes when McCarthy needed him. McCarthy knew a smear campaign was afoot against him and referenced it publicly in his 1954 Army hearing. Pearson was a journalist for decades, with his gossipy Washington merry-go-round column that Ronald Reagan took tips on what to avoid directly from Pearson. In Pearson's view, the dismissal of two members of Reagan's staff in 1967 for participating in a large gay men's orgy in Lake Tahoe was just a pretext and a part of a strategy to present the governor and his actions in a more determined and impartial light. Quote, the presence of homos in government was first raised as an issue by a well-known Republican, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, who claimed the State Department was riddled with them. Though he was not able to prove his claims, it remains a fact that a homosexual in the Defense or State Departments is automatically fired as a security risk. He can too easily be blackmailed. The reason why Reagan's press secretary is now belatedly explaining the facts behind the dropping of his two assistants may well be the desire to show that Ronnie acted quickly. Pearson was a hardcore integralitist and fully supported flooding white communities with everyone. He also was probably a communist, since he gained access to Khrushchev in 1961 with his interviews with the Soviet chairman at his summer house on the Black Sea. So McCarthy, however he managed, had the ability to sniff out communists in the capital. We have to remember this was way before the age of social media and people publishing their opinions online, so McCarthy had to rely on his own attorney-judge instinct, as well as networks of his own teams who could or could not be trusted to send him information. Pinning down Catholicism's role in the launch of the Senators' crusade against communism isn't entirely straightforward, because by the 1950s the American Catholic Church was splintering into globalists and traditionalists. Today that split is almost complete because Catholic charities and organizations flood our communities with cheap labor, illegals, and violent crime. They can be reported to the IRS using Form 990N due to their violation of their own nonprofit charter. Jack Anderson, sidekick to the influential columnist Drew Pearson, and a one-time friend of McCarthy who penned a critical early biography, knew McCarthy had a history of red baiting, but he wove a more romantic foundation myth about the senator's anti-communism. Building on a specific newspaper column by Pearson, Anderson sought to reconstruct a dinner McCarthy had in early 1950 at D.C.'s swank Colony Restaurant, with the dean of Georgetown's School of Foreign Service and two other prominent Catholics. In 1950, McCarthy desperately needed an issue to raise his political profile. He had been judge of the Wisconsin Circuit Court for the 10th Circuit from 1940 until 1947 and was senator for Wisconsin from 1947 until 1957. He would become chair of the Senate Government Operations Committee from 1953 until 1955. How about communism? Father Walsh offered at this dinner. McCarthy loved it. The government is full of communists, he said. The thing to do is hammer at them. As Anderson wrote, his three fellow Catholics went away with the feeling that the sincere McCarthy would do his country a service by speaking out against the communist fifth column. As reported by the Objective Standard's Andrew Bernstein, in February 1950, McCarthy launched a massive campaign against communists and Soviet agents working for and spying on the American government. In Senate hearings stretching across much of the first half of the 1950s, he accused numerous U.S. government employees, including many in the State Department, of being communists or agents of Soviet intelligence. He was bitterly opposed by the press, powerful members of the Senate, numerous high-ranking officials within both Truman and Eisenhower administrations, and he was finally censored by the U.S. Senate in December 1954. And died several years later at the young age of 48. The demonizations then and now involved charges that McCarthy lied, badgered, intimidated, victimized innocents, and fanned the flames of a massive witch hunt anti-communist hysteria. A typical account of his methods can be found online, which claims in widely publicized hearings McCarthy bullied defendants under cross-examination with unlawful and damaging accusations, destroying the reputations of hundreds of innocent officials and citizens. Do we believe this? The pejorative term McCarthyism was coined by his critics to denote the practice of making accusations of disloyalty, especially of pro-communist activity, in many instances unsupported by proof or based on slight, doubtful, or irrelevant evidence. McCarthy had proof, but he also respected the privacy of the men whose lives he would destroy. Even historians who investigate and expose Soviet espionage penetration of the United States government claim that McCarthy's charges were in fact based on thin evidence and that he used anti-communism for partisan purposes. The FBI also doesn't hesitate to join in the chorus of criticism. One agent said, "I was more interested in countering the activities of the Soviet KGB and GRU. McCarthy's Star Chamber proceedings, his lies and overstatements, hurt our counterintelligence efforts." But we know from the Soviet archives since the end of the Cold War that McCarthy's charges were completely correct and in some cases prophetic. It's time to examine all of the evidence objectively and to reassess McCarthy and his ability to understand the American government. In doing so, we perform an act of justice to a wrongly maligned man, and we gain greater knowledge of the Cold War, and sound a warning regarding possible espionage ongoing within the United States government. To reassess McCarthy accurately, we have to understand the murderously evil nature of communism, the massive Soviet espionage penetration of the United States government, and the specifics of numerous cases regarding McCarthy's efforts to expose that espionage. Readers can read the recent essay, The Socialist Holocaust and Its American Deniers, and its sources, especially the Black Book of Communism, which provide data taken in part from the files of numerous former communist regimes. Communism has been responsible for the murder of over 100 million innocent civilians. The Soviets targeted the Communists' main ideological enemy, the capitalist United States, even during World War I, when the two nations were supposedly allied in a death struggle against so-called fascism. Soviet agents were able to come into the American government, steal secrets, and supply data, enabling Stalin's blood-drenched regime to develop an atomic weapon years earlier. This is because the Communists and the Americans are not natural allies, and the desire to defeat Germany created an unholy alliance bathed in the blood of the Romanovs, who you can learn about on this channel. In 1937, when an American communist and courier for the GRU named Whittaker Chambers, Soviet codename Karl, decided to drop out of espionage, things changed. Chambers had grown appalled by Stalin's mass murder and by the reaction of the American Communist Party, CPUSA, which blindly followed the Soviet line. Fearful for his life and that of his wife, Chambers retained copies of stolen United States State Department documents, which he termed his life preserver. These papers came from several valued sources, one of whom was Chambers' friend and a fellow American communist. Chambers hid the material with his wife's nephew, and he and his family dropped out of sight. The primary source and friend of Chambers was State Department official Alger Hiss, so we know the State Department was compromised in at least the late 1930s. In 1939, when the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact with National Socialist Germany, thereby becoming a so-called ally of Hitler, Chambers became convinced the Soviet Union was a dangerous enemy, whose espionage activities should be revealed to American counterintelligence. This was motivated more by Chambers' hatred of nationalism, the German people, and Hitler than anything else. Zionist and anti-communist journalist Isaac Don Levine, who decided to reveal Stalin's spies once he defected to America, arranged for Chambers to meet Assistant Secretary of State Adolf Berle, FDR's top advisor regarding internal security. Berle's notes show he appreciated Chambers' emphasis on espionage against America, not merely on covert association with the communists. Berle made a list of government employees Chambers named as Soviet agents. These included State Department official Hiss, known as Lawyer or Ailes, Treasury Department official Harry Dexter White, known as Richard, and an assistant to President Roosevelt, Lachlan Curry, known as Page. FDR brusquely rebuffed Berle's mention to him of Chambers' allegations. This at a time when the Soviets were allied with Hitler and so international relations were in play, and Berle did not send his notes of the meeting with Chambers to the FBI until 1943. In the meantime, while United States counterintelligence idled, Stalin's agents engaged in massive espionage against America, relying on the defection of thousands of Jews and Zionists from Russia who were settled across the United States, usually near or inside universities. Here are three examples. The Nathan Silvermaster Group. Silvermaster, known as PAL, was a Treasury Department official who headed a spy network that included both Curry and White, as well as George Silverman, known as Elleron, who analyzed data for the United States Army, Air Force, and provided information regarding American military aviation. Frank Coe, known as PIC or Peak, was director of the Division of Monetary Research in the Treasury Department, and Solomon Adler, known as Sachs, was the Treasury Department's representative in China. Coe, Adler, and White aided the communist cause by using their authority to delay delivery of a large congressionally approved gold loan to China's nationalist government, then fighting Mao Zedong. The delay caused China's money to depreciate in value, and the ensuing inflation undercut public support for the nationalist government, hindering its fight against communism and thus allowing communism to expand its base. The Victor Perlo Group, Perlo, known as RAID, was a senior economist in the War Production Board, supervising American military-industrial production. His group included several Soviet sources. One of them, Harold Glasser, known as Ruble, was a senior Treasury Department economist. Another, Charles Kramer, known as Mole, was a United States congressional staffer. A third, Duncan Lee, known as Koch, was a lieutenant colonel in the Office of Strategic Services, which was a forerunner of the CIA, and an aide to its director, William Donovan. Although American counterintelligence efforts were more stringent to protect the Manhattan Project, the top-secret effort to develop an atomic bomb before the Nazis, they were very lax regarding communists. As one example, J. Robert Oppenheimer, known since late 1942 to the FBI as a secret member of the Communist Party, was appointed scientific head of the atom bomb project. If you saw the Oppenheimer movie, comment below as to whether this was covered or not. This decision, in light of Oppenheimer's expertise and the fact that he was not actively cooperating with Soviet intelligence, was perhaps a risk worth taking by the American intelligentsia. Nevertheless, Soviet intelligence agents permeated the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, known as Rest, a German physicist, communist, and major contributor to the Manhattan Project, supplied the Soviets important information regarding Normos, the Soviet code name for the project. Likewise, Theodore Hall, known as Malad, a young American physicist and communist, was a valuable source of information. There was also the spy ring headed by Julius Rosenberg, known as Liberal, who was an American engineer, communist, and longtime agent of Soviet intelligence. Rosenberg included his wife's brother, David Greenglass, known as Bumblebee, who was an American communist and machinist, to pass along secrets to their Soviet spy masters from New Mexico. John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clear, two leading experts on Soviet espionage, concluded numerous secret communists and Soviet sympathizers eagerly volunteered to deliver American military, technological, and diplomatic secrets to Stalin. During World War II, American counterintelligence assets were focused on defeating Germany in a long and bloody brother war. Nevertheless, it remains shocking how slowly American efforts unfolded against Stalin's espionage barrage, especially given that from August 1939 until June 1941, the Soviets and the Nazis were allies. And so we have to ask ourselves, how deep had communism infected the American government at that time? For one example of American laxity, in 1944, Catherine Perlow, Victor Perlow's ex-wife, sent a letter to President Roosevelt exposing Perlow's espionage activities against the American government and naming names. We know today that the U.S. Justice Department received this letter, but it was ignored both by those in the White House assigned to security matters and by American counterintelligence agents. Why? Was FDR too busy messing around with his mistress to notice? It was not until 1945, after World War II ended, that two momentous events finally shocked American counterintelligence into activity against the Soviets, and could pursue these events with less risk to a so-called ally. The first was the defection in Canada of Igor Guzenko, a code clerk for the Soviet intelligence group GRU. He brought with him GRU documents supporting his claims about Soviet espionage. At first, Canadian authorities paid him no mind, but eventually numerous Canadian communists were tried, convicted, and incarcerated for espionage, including a Communist Party member of Parliament. Although Guzenko's information referred largely to Canadian spies, he also provided data regarding atomic bomb spying and claimed an assistant to the United States Secretary of State was a GRU agent, a likely reference to Alger Hiss. After several weeks of his testimony, the Canadian Prime Minister flew to D.C. to brief President Truman. The Guzenko case thrust Soviet espionage to the forefront of American awareness. The documents established how deeply Soviet agents were now in Western governments, American as well as Canadian at least. But the case that most effectively augmented the termination of Soviet espionage was that of Elizabeth Bentley, known as Myrna. She and her former boss, Jacob Golos, known as Sound, ran a network of sources for Soviet intelligence. In October 1945, fearful of both FBI identification and KGB assassination, Bentley approached the FBI and turned state's evidence. Her biographer, Catherine Olmsted, wrote, "In the end, she would sign a 107-page statement naming more than 80 alleged Soviet spies in the United States. Many of those Bentley named were individuals she knew personally and who matched the list provided by Chambers and Catherine Perlow. One shadowy contact of Golo's she engaged sparingly and knew only as Julius was Julius Rosenberg. It took the FBI 5 more years to identify Rosenberg's key role in Soviet atomic espionage. One of Bentley's sources, Charles Kramer, informed her that the GRU had a prominent agent in the State Department named Hiss. McCarthy's hearings are often incorrectly conflated with the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee. That committee is best known for its investigations of globalist Department of Justice attorney and State Department employee Alger Hiss, who grilled the DuPont Company in his career. In 1944, Hiss was named director of the Office of Special Political Affairs, a policy-making entity devoted to planning for post-war international organizations and global government. Hiss served as executive secretary of the Dummerton Oaks Conference, which drew up plans for the United Nations. Hiss worked tirelessly to completely reject nationalism from the United States government. In February 1945, he personally attended the U.S. delegation at the Yalta Conference, where the Big Three, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, met to consolidate their alliance to forestall any possibility, now that the Soviets had entered German territory, that any of them might make a separate peace with the Nazis. With McCarthy on the trail of Hiss, he was also on the trail of FDR and the Dummerton Oaks Conference, these very power brokers of Washington, D.C. In late 1946, Hiss left the government to become president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he served until May 1949, the end of the presidential term to which he had been elected when he was forced to step down. In the career of Hiss from governmental agency to nonprofit, we see the machinations of the deep state. The House Un-American Activities Committee also dived into the Hollywood film industry with all its debauchery, which you can learn about on this channel, which led to the blacklisting of hundreds of actors, writers, and directors. The House Un-American Committees was a House committee, and it had no formal connection to McCarthy, who served in the Senate, although the existence of this committee thrived in part as a result of McCarthy's activities, showing the importance of the Senate and the House working together. The House Un-American Activities Committee was active for 37 years, from 1938 until 1975. Although it took years to clear out the rat's nest of Soviet agents in the U.S. government, if it ever really happened, Bentley's confession was the beginning of the end. A few were indicted, convicted, and incarcerated. Alger Hiss, in 1950, was convicted of perjury regarding denial of his handing copies of government documents to Chambers. He served 3 years in a federal jail. The initial evidence upon which Hiss was convicted is damning. For example, Chambers testified under oath that he personally knew Hiss to be a Soviet agent as early as the 1930s. Hedy Massing, known as Redhead, another Soviet agent turned state's evidence, similarly testified under oath that she personally knew Hiss to be a Soviet agent. Chambers produced his life preserver, those copies of stolen State Department documents, some written in Hiss's handwriting and some typed on Hiss's personal typewriter. But today we have additional evidence culled from Soviet, Hungarian, Czech, and American archives, all pointing, despite Hiss's lifelong protests of innocence and his long career, to his responsibility. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried, convicted, and executed for their role in providing the Soviets information regarding the American atomic bomb. The testimony of Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, was part of a strong case built by prosecutors, establishing Rosenberg as the leader of a spy ring determined to provide the Soviets with U.S. data regarding the atomic bomb. The case against Ethel was weaker, and many, including FBI Director Hoover, resisted imposition of the death penalty on the woman. But the year was 1951, and Judge Samuel Kaufman, alarmed by the communist invasion of South Korea and by a Soviet Union now armed with nuclear weapons, nevertheless imposed that penalty. Nevertheless, most American agents of Soviet intelligence never suffered legal penalty or were caught. Under remorseless FBI pressure, many either resigned from or were forced out of U.S. government employment and simply joined universities or private practice. Even today, some of McCarthy's critics deny the extent or even the existence of Soviet spying. But given the evidence now available, this position is untenable. Evidence from numerous sources definitively establishes a massive Soviet espionage barrage during World War II, employing numerous Communist Party of the United States partisans against the United States government. One such source is the Soviet archives. We know from the JFK assassination papers many archives are destroyed or simply go missing in America. Another source is the Venona Project, a top-secret World War II enterprise in which U.S. military intelligence agents, distrusting Stalin, cracked the Soviet code and for several years decrypted and read numerous Soviet cables. Venona was classified by President Clinton in 1995. The trove of FBI files are also made accessible under the Freedom of Information Act passed by President Obama, which every U.S. citizen can use. But McCarthy's most knowledgeable critics have never denied Soviet espionage. Rather, they claim that by the time McCarthy burst onto the anti-communist public scene in 1950, the purge of Soviet agents and identified communists at state and other government agencies was complete, and McCarthy was simply an annoying rabble-rouser. This claim is laughable. All McCarthy could do, and did, these critics claim, in order to make a name for himself was smear and ruin the reputation of so many innocent people. This charge remains the conventional wisdom regarding McCarthy. We know that by 1950 many Soviet agents had been allowed to resign quietly from U.S. government employment. But that is not all. There were many still Soviet agents and communists working for U.S. government agencies. McCarthy did not name names in public hearings because he desired to protect the reputations of those not yet proven to be communists or Soviet spies. He respected the privacy of his fellow Americans, which probably contributed to his downfall. For example, McCarthy would bring to the attention of the Senate and or the public details of case number, let's say, 17, seeking to show communist loyalties without divulging the individual's name. In the absence of knowing the person's name, it was very difficult for journalists or historians to fact-check the specific accusations. Some of McCarthy's hearings were held in executive session, records of which were sealed by the Senate for some 50 years, not open to the public until 2003, and even now tracing those records is very hard. We know the identities of the parties involved for some of the matters. Strongly suspected in McCarthy's day and known with absolute certainty in ours, the Communist Party of the USA was controlled from Moscow and was an instrument of Soviet policy. The Communist Party of the U.S. continued to take orders from Moscow, and Haynes and Clare, based on extensive research in Soviet archives, wrote, "The essence of American communism was loyalty to Stalin." This requirement to be loyal to a genocidal maniac, Stalin, instead of an ideal, reflects the reality that communism is inherently anti-American and must be rejected. Haynes and Clear further noted there were hundreds of American communists who abetted Soviet espionage. The party chief himself, Earl Browder, known as Helmsman, knowingly and purposely assisted Soviet spies. Espionage was a regular activity of the American Communist Party. McCarthy sought merely to remove such communists from government employment, not to incarcerate them in Leavenworth, nor deny them employment in anywhere else, nor to hound them or besmirch them in perpetuity, but only to fire them from the American government. His objective was to protect the American people, not to ruin individuals for falling into idealistic hell. In February 1950, when McCarthy launched his public crusade, were there still extensive security breaches within the United States government involving known or suspected communists? Yes. In May 1950, for example, as public furor over McCarthy's efforts swelled, Soviet agent Solomon Adler, known as Sachs, was still employed by the Treasury Department. With McCarthy a skilled attorney and judge on the trail, Adler fled first to his native England, but then to communist China, where he faithfully served the Mao Zedong regime that he helped instate. Adler's emphasis on the theft of trade secrets to establish a government helped give China a leg up. Why would China have to rely on its own innovation if it could simply steal it and rely on individuals like Adler to do so? Adler had been identified as a Soviet agent by both Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley, and confirmed by research into the Soviet archives. William Remington was case number 19 in McCarthy's initial Senate presentation. Remington has been identified by federal sleuths as an active communist while in college, and then began working for the Tennessee Valley Authority. He had been named as a Soviet agent by Elizabeth Bentley, to whom he passed information regarding airplane production. Eventually he was tried, convicted, and incarcerated for perjury regarding his involvement in the Communist Party. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a recovered KGB memo listed Remington among 42 others as Soviet spies likely exposed by Bentley to the United States government. In 1950, he was still working for the United States Commerce Department, and McCarthy knew it. Annie Lee Moss is often portrayed as the quintessential McCarthy victim, and the race card is played. She was a black woman, seemingly frail, who had been employed as a cafeteria worker. She denied any involvement with the Communist Party. But FBI agent Mary Marquard, who, starting in 1942 and continuing for 7 years as a deep cover spy inside the Communist Party, identified Moss as a Communist Party member. The FBI shared this information with other government agencies. Despite this, in 1950, she obtained a post as a code clerk for the United States Army Signal Corps and received appropriate security clearance, handling sensitive material, some of it in plain text, so she could read it and share it herself. She was still in this position when McCarthy investigated her in 1954. Moss claimed a case of mistaken identity because there were multiple women named Annie Lee Moss. There was an Anna Lee Moss, an Annie Moss, and Annie L. Moss. The Moss testifying to McCarthy's committee acknowledged she had been a cafeteria worker, had lived with Hattie Griffin, received the Daily Worker, the communist newspaper, and lived at 72 R Street, which matched the FBI records from her investigation. The FBI and McCarthy had the right Annie Lee Moss. Far from being an innocent victim, she was a communist working in the United States government, handling confidential Army material and codes to other spies. Frank Coe, known as Pick or Peek, like Adler, helped stop American aid to Chiang Kai-shek, thereby abetting the communist cause in China. In 1950, Coe worked for the International Monetary Fund, which still exists today, an intergovernmental agency founded in large part by his former superior at the Treasury Department, Harry Dexter White, who was also a communist. In that year, American pressure finally forced him out. Coe was called to testify at the McCarthy hearings regarding his work for the communist cause, and he pleaded the Fifth. In 1958, he moved permanently to China, working there for Mao. In 1959, he wrote essays supporting a massive Maoist purge of Chinese society, euphemism for genocide or mass murder, claiming that indoctrination in Marxist-Leninist theory had substantially increased Chinese economic production. Like Adler, Coe had been identified as a Soviet apparatchik by both Chambers and Bentley, accusations later confirmed by Venona de Cripps. McCarthy's 1953 investigation into security laxity at Fort Monmouth, a network of labs spread among several New Jersey towns, revealed egregious leaks of confidential information. Anti-aircraft systems, missile detection, radar, and other advanced electronics for the American military were researched there. Security personnel at Monmouth were reportedly surprised at how lax everything was and reported their suspicions to U.S. government superiors, but were persistently overruled. And so we see the disconnect outside of Washington, D.C., where the Beltway ignores reality outside its bubble. Because of such laxity, substantial amounts of classified information were stolen and transmitted to the Soviets. As one example, a McCarthy staffer tracked down in West Germany an East German defector, a technician named Harold Butner, who signed a notarized statement swearing that, when employed at a Soviet scientific installation in 1950, he had witnessed transcripts coming from Monmouth. Further, subsequent to McCarthy's hearings, a Soviet defector informed congressional investigators that vast amounts of information pertaining to U.S. radar had been smuggled into Soviet hands from Monmouth. Finally, a United States Army intelligence officer acknowledged our latest Signal Corps developments were appearing in the hands of the North Korean communists, and presumably aiding them in killing United States servicemen during the Korean War. This is absolutely inconceivable treason. Numerous employees at Monmouth treated confidential secrets as personal property, reproducing documents and taking them home. Literally thousands of official papers went missing from the Monmouth lab complex. This still happens today, with commuters reporting documents from the United States Patent Office and other agencies are left on the D.C. Metro. Monmouth crawled with suspects. Aaron Coleman was a childhood schoolmate of subsequently convicted communist agents Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel, and admitted he attended a Young Communist League meeting with Rosenberg. Rosenberg claimed to have had contact with Coleman while at Monmouth. Coleman was one of many Monmouth employees who took home classified documents. In 1946, security agents searched his home and found 40 official documents, some of them confidential. When McCarthy opened his investigation in the United States Army, Coleman still worked at Monmouth, although on a basis of restricted security. Ruth Levine was another suspicious character. She worked for the Federal Telecommunications Lab, a Monmouth affiliate, for a decade, held a top-secret security clearance, and had been accused by former communist John Saunders of belonging to a communist cell. Questioned at the hearings whether she belonged to the Communist Party or had ever engaged in espionage, she refused to answer and pled the fifth. Because of the McCarthy hearings, Levine was finally sacked from her position, helping keep American secrets safe. Coleman and Levine were just two major security risks at Monmouth. McCarthy's hearings identified many others. McCarthy had a lot of reason to be concerned regarding the security problem in the United States military. The fiasco is summed up in a public exchange between McCarthy and Andrew Reed, Monmouth's longtime security chief. McCarthy, have you repeatedly furnished information on individuals who you considered to be very dangerous to the security of this country, and discovered that they were kept on year after year, even after you had supplied the complete facts on them? Reed, yes, sir. In addition to exposing Adler, Remington, Moss, Coe, and the security debacle at Fort Monmouth, McCarthy exposed various instances of severe laxity on the part of the U.S. government. McCarthy may have been mistaken in some cases. He was a hard-drinking, pugnacious political street fighter. He was sometimes impulsive, sloppy, and bombastic. He was a flawed champion for a noble cause. He was a man. But in battle after endless battle, he was right. Returning back to his Catholic community, Father Walsh and others jumped at McCarthy's idea about a universal dole for the elderly. Quote, Joe McCarthy might well have gone forth in all his aggressiveness to win for himself a pedestal in the pantheon of fighting liberals. And so we see this mix of socialism and anti-communism that is and was American nationalism. A dinner happened a month before McCarthy's widely covered speech to a women's Republican club in Wheeling, West Virginia, and you can read this speech online. The avidly anti-communist Father Welsh probably did urge McCarthy to play a more active role on the issue, whether or not he used the words attributed to him. And shortly after that dinner, McCarthy asked one of his speechwriters for a talk on subversion in government. But this was not a born-again movement suggested by Anderson and all those who have repeated it. McCarthy didn't need anyone to point him to an issue he had been talking about for years and had studied in college. The Catholic Church in the early 1950s was ardently anti-communist and explicitly pro-McCarthy. It was the wild reaction he would generate in his breakout anti-red tirade in Wheeling, West Virginia, that convinced him of the political hay he could make from it. Whatever launched it, McCarthy's home front holy war against the communists and the subversives got a huge lift from his fellow Catholics. The ardor sprang not just from a right-of-center ideology, but from an eagerness to overcome anti-Catholic bias by showing that rather than harboring fealty to Rome and the Pope, American Catholics were just as American as apple pie. Additionally, American Catholics had no problem rallying behind a Catholic McCarthy, whereas today in American society groups are much more fragmented. 58% of American Catholics at the time were favorably inclined towards Senator McCarthy, a January 1954 Gallup poll found, compared with 23% unfavorable and 19% who had no opinion. And you can learn more about one of the co-founders of Gallup in the White Hill Mansion video on this channel. Lila Mae Edwards, the wife of the Chicago Tribune journalist Willard Edwards, found the same thing when she volunteered at the McCarthy office. She watched as mass cards, rosaries, and crucifixes fell out of the mail sent to McCarthy. The fact that McCarthy was devoted to his faith made it easy to equate Catholicism with patriotism, and anti-communism with pro-McCarthyism, and it is accurate. While most Catholics were McCarthy boosters, so were most Americans. Catholics were just 8 to 10 percentage points more supportive of their Wisconsin boy than the rest of the population. In his 1952 re-election campaign, McCarthy got only marginally more backing from Wisconsin Catholics than did the rest of the slate of Republicans. Nationally, his Catholic support was strongest among the working class, the upper crust, Republicans, Bostonians, and Irish Catholics. The most commanding Catholic voice at the time was the pro-McCarthy Cardinal Francis Joseph Spellman of New York. Liberal Catholics produced offsetting roars from the Association of Catholic Trade Unionists, the journal Commonweal, and Bishop Bernard Shiel of Chicago. Condemning anti-communism, Bishop Shiel wrote, "feeds on the meat of suspicion and grows great on the dissension among Americans, which it cynically creates and keeps alive by a mad pursuit of headlines." Bishop Shiel also lashed out at the city slicker from Appleton, who was taking people in like country rubes. McCarthy, a city slicker? Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of what would become America's first dynasty, was outraged when fellow Catholics criticized McCarthy even indirectly. Monsignor John A. O'Brien of the University of Notre Dame did criticize McCarthy, alongside two other leaders of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Kennedy complained to his friend John Kavanaugh, the former president of Notre Dame, "I don't think it does Notre Dame any good to have Father O'Brien signing petitions for the Christians and Jews with Notre Dame behind his name. I always thought that organization was completely dominated by the Jews, and they just use Catholic names for the impression it makes throughout the country." Robert F. Kennedy likely disagreed with his father. As in his battle against the chaos from the civil rights movement, he aligned himself with Jewish interests, probably to his demise. But the Attorney General Kennedy did embrace the political philosopher Peter Weirich's observation that anti-Catholicism is the anti-Semitism of the intellectual. And he joked that the ideal headline in the Jewish-led New York Times would be, "More nuns leave the church." If the Kennedys saw a conspiracy among critics of the Catholic Church, an FBI source reported a plot in which, quote, "a group of Catholics in the United States led by Cardinal Spellman is at odds with the Vatican regarding various foreign issues." The source referred to the Cardinal's followers as a conspiracy working to undermine the Eisenhower administration and to eventually bring about the election of Senator Joseph McCarthy as president. He claimed McCarthy as receiving the support of many wealthy Catholics, including prominent individuals such as ex-ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. He stated he was not anti-Catholic, and he claimed he has many friends who are ardent members of that church. No surprise, perhaps, that there were so many conspiracies stemming from this. The push-pull within the church was mirrored by various magazines up until the 2000s. The editors started out skeptical of the senator, but were somewhat open-minded. But as McCarthy showed he had no sign of stopping, the media amped up its criticism to the point where the senator branded its coverage completely and viciously false. McCarthy was lampooned in political cartoons. He was refused entry into various DC soirees. He was truly an enemy of the state. The senator's demagoguery also deepened fault lines between Protestants and Catholics. Protestants presumed Catholics supported the senator merely because he was Catholic. Catholics proposed an equally simplistic take on his Protestant detractors. The truth is that at his peak, McCarthy had the support of 49% of Protestants, which was just 1 point below his national rating. Jews, with their leanings towards communism, were the one religious group who consistently and overwhelmingly rejected him, with 15% viewing him favorably and 71% unfavorably. The seeds of McCarthy's reckoning were planted in the fall of 1953 when he put the United States Army in his crosshairs. The timing was all wrong. The United States Army was just getting out of Korea. The shine wasn't off of it from World War II. McCarthy had picked the most stout-hearted and sacrosanct institution to make in the United States to make his closing case that the government was infested with communists. For good measure, he poked the war hero President Eisenhower in the eye, referring to him as a Johnny-come-lately to the home front Cold War, and then slandered his faction of moderate Republicans as the party of appeasement, retreat, and surrender, words that remain true to this day. The scrappiest of lawmakers was going eye to eye with the nation's mighty fighting machine, and gambling that the other side would blink first. McCarthy was also relying on his relatively new counsel, Ray Cohen, and Cohen's relationship with U.S. Army spokesman Joe Welch. Toward the end of the 1954 hearing, McCarthy seems to realize that the Democrat Cohen and Welch, with their Jewish backgrounds, had much more in common than he realized. Cohen was gay, HIV positive, and eventually disbarred for trying to defraud one of his clients out of his entire estate. He was also a mentor to Donald Trump in his Manhattan real estate transactions. As McCarthy ratcheted up his attacks, the media ramped up its criticism to the point where the senator branded its coverage completely as viciously false, as has been said. But McCarthy knew if he didn't rid the military of communists, all would be lost. Perhaps he should have focused on the Treasury or the State Department or the IRS, but he went where the trail led and relied on potentially biased staff. At the 1954 Army-McCarthy hearings, which explored the senator's accusations and the military's countercharges, McCarthy watched as his support nosedived, from a full half of Americans before the proceedings to merely a third as they wrapped up in June. Approval also plummeted among Catholics, his base. Anti-communist backers remained steadfast. The public verdict on the senator's performance and the Army's was a plague on both your houses, pronounced John Fenton, an editor at Gallup. The U.S. Army enlisted Harvard-trained lawyer Joe Welch to defend it. Welch focused on the attitude of McCarthy rather than the substance of his arguments, and was taken aback when McCarthy attacked another Harvard graduate, Fred Fisher, of Welch's firm Hale and Dorr. What could a Wisconsin rural boy know about Harvard? You can practically hear the arrogance in Welch's voice. Fisher was a dual Israeli citizen and died in Tel Aviv in 1989. That December 1954, by a margin of 67 to 22, McCarthy's Senate colleagues denounced the Wisconsin rebel for supposedly having treated fellow members with contempt. All 44 Democrats banded against McCarthy and voted against him. 22 of 44 Republicans joined them. Only 2 of the 8 Catholic senators sided with their fellow Catholic. who himself cast a neutral ballot as president. Republican Alexander Wiley of Wisconsin did not vote to censor McCarthy, nor did the Democrat John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. Wiley was afraid of alienating McCarthy's home state. Kennedy blamed his recent back surgery. In this, we see a weakness that Kennedy would perhaps lean into during his presidency, but he did have some Catholic unity. Kennedy did clarify his position, contradicting modern historians, when he wrote a note to his staff that he hoped McCarthy would not be censored, since it wasn't McCarthy that divided the country, and you can read this note in the JFK Presidential Library. In 1954, it almost seemed like McCarthy was being repeatedly beat up. In late July 1954, the Senate began debating a censure resolution against McCarthy, which witnesses connected with an escalation in his drinking. He was then hospitalized with an elbow injury, and then finally censored in December 1954. He was photographed with his elbow in a sling. Was he pushed? After the censor vote, McCarthy was in the hospital frequently for what was reported as sinus trouble, bursitis, or inflammation, broken bones, and exhaustion. Broken bones? After his condemnation and censure, McCarthy continued to perform his senatorial duties for another 2.5 years. His career as a major public figure, however, had been ruined, and the press would not touch him. His colleagues in the Senate avoided him. His speeches on the Senate floor were delivered to a near-empty chamber or received with intentional displays of inattention. Outside speaking engagements dwindled almost to nothing, and McCarthy had no base to rely on. Instead of leaning into the new role as pariah, McCarthy lost his passion. Eisenhower, freed from McCarthy's political intimidation and still annoyed about his army attack, quipped to his cabinet that McCarthyism was now McCarthyism. Still, McCarthy did not forget to fight against communism. He warned against attendance at summit conferences with the Reds, saying you cannot offer friendship to tyrants and murderers without advancing the cause of tyranny and murder. He declared coexistence with communists is neither possible nor honorable nor desirable. Our long-term objective must be the eradication of communism from the face of the earth. In one of his final acts in the Senate, McCarthy opposed President Eisenhower's nomination to the Supreme Court of William J. Brennan. After reading a speech Brennan had given shortly before in which he characterized McCarthy's anti-communist investigations as witch hunts, McCarthy's opposition failed to gain any traction, and he was the only senator to vote against the justice's confirmation. McCarthy's biographers argue he was a changed man for the worse after the censure. Declining both physically and emotionally, he became a, quote, pale ghost of his former self, in the words of Fred G. Cook. It was reported McCarthy suffered cirrhosis of the liver due to his boozy lunches and cocktails after lunch, and was frequently hospitalized for alcohol abuse. Numerous eyewitnesses, including Senate aide George Reedy and journalist Tom Wicker, reported finding him drunk in the Senate. Journalist Richard Rovera wrote in 1959 he had always been a heavy drinker, and there were times in those seasons of discontent when he drank more than ever. But he was not always drunk. He went on the wagon. For him this meant beer instead of whiskey, for days and weeks at a time. The difficulty toward the end was that he couldn't hold it. He went on to pieces on his second or third drink, and he did not snap back quickly. Supposedly, McCarthy also became addicted to morphine. Harry J. Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, became aware of McCarthy's addiction in the 1950s and demanded he stop using the drug. Who gave McCarthy that first syringe? Was it his new staffers? Did this happen in some cloakroom? Supposedly, McCarthy refused to give up morphine. In Anslinger's memoir, The Murderers, McCarthy is anonymously quoted as saying, "I wouldn't try to do anything about it, Commissioner. It will be the worse for you. And if it winds up in a public scandal and that should hurt this country, I wouldn't care. The choice is yours." Does that really sound like McCarthy? Anslinger decided to give McCarthy access to morphine in secret from a pharmacy in Washington, D.C. Supposedly, the morphine was paid for by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics right up to McCarthy's death. So was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics shooting up McCarthy? Anslinger never publicly named McCarthy, and he threatened with prison a journalist who uncovered the story. However, McCarthy's identity was known to Anslinger's agents, and journalist Maxine Cheshire confirmed his identity with Will Orsler, co-author of The Murderers, in 1978. In April 1957, McCarthy was urgently admitted to Bethesda Naval Hospital for a knee injury, and he was in an oxygen tent for days while listed in serious condition. Blood tests revealed elevated liver enzymes and abnormal liver function. The diagnosis was severe alcoholic hepatitis, inflammation of the liver due to excessive drinking. It's usually found in association with fatty liver, but it can be controlled by medication and sobriety. But just a few days later, in early May 1957, McCarthy died at the age of 48. His death certificate listed the cause as hepatitis acute, cause unknown. Cause unknown? Wasn't it supposed to be alcohol? Did someone inject McCarthy with something? Did someone ply him with alcohol at the hospital? 4 days after his passing, a pontifical high requiem mass was held at the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle in Washington, D.C., where McCarthy had wed his wife 4 years earlier. As 2,000 mourners listened, Monsignor John J. Cartwright said McCarthy's role in raising an alarm about communism will be more and more honored as history unfolds its record. Later that day, McCarthy was memorialized in the chamber of the Senate he had joined at the young age of 38, and where 7 years later his colleagues voted overwhelmingly to condemn him. The last senator given a Senate funeral had been William Borah back in 1940, although Senate leaders were quick to point out they would do it for any senator whose family asked, as Gene had. As of 2020, McCarthy is the last Republican to win Wisconsin's Class I Senate seat. "This fallen warrior through death speaketh," said Chaplain Frederick Brown Harris on the floor of the Senate, calling a nation of free men to be delivered from the complacency of a false security, and from regarding those who loudly sound the trumpets of vigilance and alarm as mere disturbers of the peace. Vice President Richard Nixon, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, 3 of McCarthy's 6 siblings, and Gene McCarthy joined the 2,000 mourners. McCarthy's body was flown by military plane from Washington to Green Bay, with 3 of his closest Senate colleagues accompanying him. Then it was driven to Appleton. Many packed the pews at St. Mary's Church and spilled onto the streets outside the Irish parish where Joseph Raymond McCarthy had been baptized and then eulogized. Senator McCarthy was a dedicated man, not a fanatic, the Reverend Adam Grill intoned. "The guidance of our beloved land is under the guidance of human beings, and as human beings we are all fallible." Flags across the city were flown at half-staff, the way they had been at the White House and other public buildings in the Capitol, and Appleton schools and shops were shuttered at midday. This was the last of 3 memorials to the senator, and the first in the state that had easily and repeatedly elected him and loved him. 25,000 friends and fans from Green Bay, Neenah, and his native Grand Chute paid their respects at his open casket. Others kept vigil outside the church alongside honor guards of military police, Boy Scouts, members of the Knights of Columbus. Flying in to join them were 19 senators, 7 congressmen, and other luminaries, many of whom were Catholic. McCarthy was buried in nearby St. Mary's Cemetery at his favorite spot on a tree-lined bluff overlooking the Fox River. As triple volleys were fired by a rifle squad from the Marine Corps and Catholic war veterans, Gene McCarthy stood at attention. The casket was slowly lowered into the ground between the graves of his parents, where a simple stone would read, "Joseph R. McCarthy, United States Senator, November 1908, May 1957. Never confuse a single defeat with a final defeat."